Josias, and thank you very much to the ECODEMIA group for inviting me, and I'm very honored to be here and to share with you some of the things I've been learning from Indigenous people over the past 3 decades or so. I'm going to try a slightly different way of introducing the concept of flourishing diversity by trying to share something of the way that many Indigenous groups understand us. And when I say us, I'm referring to urban-based, salaried, educated people who are often called the weird people, Western, industrialized, educated, rich, and so-called developed. Their views on us and some of the terror that our lifestyles are inflicting upon the life support system, which we all depend upon. But to do that, I will, of course, be sharing their voices in their own words, but I wanted to try and translate some of it into the sort of notions that are more familiar to weird people. And they have words for us that have interesting similarities. In the North, many North American groups refer to us as Wetiko. In many Amazonian groups, we are called Kowari or Kowori. In Central Africa, among the hunter-gatherers I know well, we're called Mundele. In Ghana, where I was, for instance, we're called Obruni. And there is this category of these often mostly white, often European descent people who've been, in the past 500 years, racing around the world, imposing their particular model of life on those environments and the peoples that they have found there. And it has had a very destabilizing effect on the life support systems that we depend upon. In order to try and share some of that, I want to take us on a little brief reflection on the extraordinary happenstance, the extraordinary luck that we exist at all. And just to contemplate for a few moments just how unlikely our very existence is. So in the way that astronomers understand the history of the universe, it was some 4.7 thousand million years ago that the universe emerged from a point of infinitesimal density to create all the matter that exists in the many, many galaxies that are compose the universe today. A few hundred million years after the Great Bang, our planet Earth was a lump of stardust that was orbiting around our sun and just inertly moving about. There was water on its surface and there were rocks and so on, but there was no life. Then 4.5 billion years ago, a huge lump of space debris that is called by people Theia, about the size of Mars today, collided with the Earth. And in that collision, it set the Earth spinning, and the force of the impact forced the iron core of Theia to enter into the Earth and end up in the middle of our planet. The collision was so forceful, it tilted the axis of the Earth by 23.5 degrees, which is what made the possibility of seasons happen. The spin that the Earth was set on was what allowed us to ensure that all parts of the planet were exposed to the sun. We don't have a dark side like our moon. And the asymmetric shape of the Earth after this collision held the debris of Theia close enough to the Earth to form the moon. And of course, that's what maintains the pull, the gravitational pull that shifts our oceans, that creates the tides, which was so important, especially in the early period of the Earth, because the tides would be drawn hundreds of meters up and hundreds of meters down, and that constant washing of the surface of the Earth is what created the continents or began the journey of the continents that we now live on today. So it was really a remarkably unlikely event that unfolded thousands of millions of years ago that has made planet Earth a viable place for life to begin to flourish. And the conditions that have enabled life to evolve on Earth are directly set out in that moment of our encounter with what has become our moon. And that stardust that was and is our planet is what everything has come from. We are all stardust. Everything that exists is that stardust transformed into a different form, dancing with life for a limited period, and then returning to dust again, awaiting absorption into new life. And the NASA Kepler Space Telescope has been roaming outside our atmosphere to take extraordinarily detailed photographs of other galaxies in different parts of the universe. And using a citizen science program called SETI at Home, they've been looking at the stars that they identify in these solar systems composing these numerous galaxies. And they look for the zone around the star, which would create conditions where water would be stable on the surface of those planets. And the idea is that if we could find planets revolving around those stars which are in what is called the habitable zone, then there might well be life on them too. But after looking at literally millions of potential candidates, there are just 219 planet candidates that inhabit the life zone around a star. And only 10 of those are near Earth size and orbiting in the star's habitable zone. So in all this enormity of the infinite space around us, there are just 10 similar planets to our own. And the closest of those planets is 300 light years away. That means if you travel at the speed of light, the speed with which light travels from the sun to this planet, for 300 solid years, then you will reach the nearest possible place where life might exist. The cosmic luck that we have to be able to inhabit this green oasis in the vastness of the universe, which is largely devoid of life, really is extraordinary. It really is mind-boggling. When I contemplate it, my mind spirals in reverence for our dear planet and the very unlikely circumstances that have made possible the dance with stardust that I experience as Jerome. So while the creation of Spaceship Earth was such an extraordinarily lucky event, the slow incremental evolution of life is also one that has been incredibly lucky to survive until today. It's not been an easy journey for life. There have been at least five major extinction events, each one provoked by highly unlikely events. The black swans, as we call them in today's language, completely unpredictable and unlikely things that occur. And when they occur, they have such a dramatic impact that they completely transform the reality as we knew it before the black swan event. It may well be that COVID is one of those black swan events. We will watch it unfold. In the past, the black swan events, or at least the ones that we can fairly reliably understand, have been massive volcanic eruptions or asteroid impacts that have so devastated the possibilities for life to continue that there's been huge extinctions going on. The third great extinction that you can see on this figure led to 95% of species on Earth disappearing. These were really momentous times, and it took life not just a few thousand years, but tens, hundreds of thousands of years to re-establish itself. And these events just are on a different scale to the lifetime of human beings. It's very difficult for us to get our head around these things. But what is really striking is that we are currently entering the 6th probable extinction event. And that one is caused by our own actions. And it says on this chart Homo sapiens, but of course it's not all Homo sapiens. It's Homo sapiens like me, who live in urban centers, who are weird, who consume most of their food from places they're not even aware of. It comes in from on aeroplanes and boats, from spaces that we have no idea of or what's going on in them. And our consumption and the inequalities with which we consume have produced a situation which is causing massive species loss. Just in Central Europe since the 1970s, it appears from studies in national parks in Germany that up to 70% of insects have disappeared. And when you think about the relationship insects have for pollinating the fruit and vegetables we eat and many other creatures eat, or their role as food for birds, for amphibians, and for many other creatures, you suddenly start to realize that the consequences of our actions are stupendous, are mind-bogglingly powerful. So how has life survived these different extinctions? Well, what life does to protect itself from such uncertainty, from these black swan events, is to produce as much diversity as it can in the time available. And that's, for instance, one reason why evolution has settled for sexual reproduction, which, in comparison to, say, cloning, seems like a very unnecessarily lengthy and complex business. Mating and the whole business of finding a mate and settling on a mate, and each of the partners working together to create new life is complex. But what it does is it ensures uniqueness. Every single offspring will be somehow different to the other. And then when some major event happens, because there are these gradations of difference, there is diversity within, not just within species, but of course between species. Life has the maximum chance that some of those differences will be the differences that make the crucial difference between survival or death. And it's that constant cultivation of diversity that is the only way that life has been able to maintain its existence on Earth. And it builds that diversity into the systems for reproducing life, but also from the systems that give energy for life to be present and to reproduce. So, for instance, every organism depends on a diversity of raw materials which it consumes, and in that consumption it gets energy, and that energy allows it to feed again and to reproduce, but it produces waste from that energy, and that waste is useless to the organism that produces it. But in conjunction with other organisms and other wastes from other processes of energy creation, life is able to continue and find new fuel. So this closed system of our planet is extraordinarily efficient in using what is essentially just stardust to produce an extraordinary diversity of living organisms, of living forms. And that diversity really is extraordinary. The story of our previous age, the Holocene, is perhaps illustrative here. So the Holocene was the period after the ice began to melt. So in the last ice age, there were up to 2 kilometers of ice over many parts of Europe. And this, of course, made no life possible underneath that ice. But as that ice started to melt, it opened up new spaces for agile, enthusiastic species to come in and colonize. And as those new species left the refugia that had protected them from the ice, they began to cohabitate with other species. And if one was too virulent, it would kill off all the other species that were there, and then itself would die off. So what effectively happened is those species where some sort of equilibrium could be found between the needs of the different species so that they develop these complex symbiotic relationships over time. And it does take many, many generations for these relationships to develop. And it was in that process of these species moving in, coming together with new species that they hadn't necessarily lived with before, finding their balance, that the meadows of Europe, the forests of the Northern Hemisphere, the wetlands, the vast wetlands, were produced as the ice retreated. And that plurality of species has enjoyed an unprecedented period of stability, the Holocene, in which the diversity has flourished and produced what we recognize as the extraordinariness of life on Earth. So life is constantly and tirelessly producing diversity in order to assure a future, no matter what. The tragedy of our times is that our dominant economic system, what we call growth-based neoliberal economics today, that so many of us rely on for our daily food and our shelter, is, in the words recently coined by Daniel Vahl, a dangerous ideology that seems to produce mass delusion and collective suicidal tendencies, oblivious to the biophysical reality and socio-ecological context. In finance, we call this externalities, profit-seeking behaviors that someone engages in gain profits without paying the true costs involved in obtaining those profits. Constant growth on a finite planet is, of course, reaching its limits, not because of our planet's ability to support life, but because our markets are not respecting the principles on which life thrives. We're imposing on rich areas of forest, for instance. We cut down the forest, turning that forest into timber for building and other uses. And then we plant plantations of say, palm oil or, well, not cocoa, but other crops onto those areas we've cut down for timber. And those crops turn those areas into sort of green deserts, just one single asset organism that is designed purely for market consumption. And that transforms huge areas of very complex symbiotic relationships between many, many species into these single monocultures. And these monocultures are impoverishing not just the landscape, but the livelihoods of ourselves in the long run and many, many other species. And each of us, if you just think of yourself as a human being, well, actually, it's not quite true. You are also, you actually have more bacteria cells living in your body than you do human cells inherited from your parents. And you have many, many more benign viruses, or the majority are benign, living in your body simultaneously. So if we do it simply on a quantity basis, we are more bacteria or more virus than we are human. But actually, that's not the point. The point is that even my human body, ignoring the bacteria and viruses that constitute it, is enmeshed in a whole set of relations which are the dependent on all these other organisms around me. The chair I sit on, the food I eat in the mornings is all produced from these other organisms. We are nested within one another, just as the bacteria that eat the food or eat some of the food that comes into my stomach and break it down so that I can then absorb the bits I need, are all nested within one another. And we are in turn nested within greater environments. And that constant process of nesting is the symbiosis that produces and promotes and maintains life on this planet. But by not taking into account of that in the ways that we produce food, wealth, and other items for our consumption, we are ignoring and leaving for future generations to deal with some very, very serious problems. And it's no wonder, really, that it is the young people, the children, who are complaining the loudest. They really have a lot to think about, and we really need to support them in that. 30 years of climate science showing how we're destabilizing our life support system in great detail. Even the coining of this term, the Anthropocene, to try and focus minds on the impact that our livelihoods and choices of ways of living are having on the global biosphere, are not sufficient to produce the change, or not yet sufficient to produce the change that's required. And what to do, the way we're describing things like climate change, it's the clouds. What can I do about the clouds? I'm just sitting here in London. How can I change the clouds? What can I do about this climate? How can we respond? What is an appropriate response in this context? What is an appropriate solution? How can we find solutions? Is it going to just be through people's assemblies cutting CO2 emissions? Or is there more we need to do? The oxymoronic ideas like sustainable development or payment for ecosystem services, these crazy ideas are the ones that the powerful are investing their time and energies in. But what is the system change that really is needed? How can it be conceived in a way that enables every citizen to act? How can it be globally relevant to anyone regardless of their cultural background? Well, this is what we're trying to, or what we believe that the concept of flourishing diversity offers. It's an invitation for each person to use their creative intelligence to align their lives with those life-enhancing principles on which life depends, on diversity. And to express this in the relationships that they maintain, each of us maintains with the other species around us and the other people that we come into contact with. What's very interesting is that the research is now catching up with this, and it realizes that wherever we have great cultural diversity, we also have great biological diversity. And principally, the reason is that human beings are keystone species in whatever ecological system they inhabit. And as keystone species, we have an inordinate influence on those ecosystems. So if we can really find ways to enhance the diversity of the spaces that we have influence over, then each of us can start to become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. There are, of course, things like consuming with care for Gaia, for the earth, resisting corporate efforts to grab more and more territory from those people who are caring for these complex multi-species assemblages. And many other things, of course. But as a conceptual basis for how we can achieve system change, flourishing diversity offers a very simple and a grounded way for each of us to engage with that. But where did we learn about this from? Well, it came through studying those people who do inhabit those beautiful parts of the world that really are still very important, central, in fact, to the biosphere that we inhabit. Every tree in a forest is like a fountain, sucking water out of the ground through its roots and releasing water vapor into the atmosphere through the pores in its foliage, in its leaves. In their billions, trees create giant rivers of water that flow into the air and form the clouds that create rainfall hundreds and even thousands of miles away from the actual forest that the water evaporated from. The Amazon is largely responsible for the weather systems of our planet. But as we share the planet, as we shave the planet of trees, we risk drying up these aerial rivers and the lands that depend on them for rain. And more research suggests that this hitherto neglected impact of deforestation could, in many continental interiors, dwarf the impacts of global climate change. It could dry up the Nile, hobble the Asian monsoon, and desiccate fields from Argentina to the Midwest of the United States of America. Modern science is just making these realizations, but for the indigenous inhabitants of these forests, the immeasurable value of the world, the environment around them, has been clear for generations. And I'd like to just share with you the very poignant views of Nemonte Nenquimo. She recently published a letter in The Guardian 5 days ago on the 12th of October. My name is Nemonte Nenquimo. I am a Warani woman, a mother and a leader of my people. The Amazon rainforest is my home. I'm writing you this letter because the fires are raging still, because the corporations are spilling oil in our rivers, because the miners are stealing gold, as they have been for 500 years, and leaving behind open pits and toxins, because the land grabbers are cutting down primary forests so that the cattle can graze, plantations can be grown, and the white man can eat. Because our elders are dying from coronavirus, while you are planning your next moves to cut up our lands to stimulate an economy that has never benefited us. Because as Indigenous people, we are fighting to protect what we love, our way of life, our rivers, the animals, our forests, life on earth. And it's time that you listened to us. In each of our many hundreds of different languages across the Amazon, we have a word for you, the outsider, the stranger. In my language, Wautedo, this word is kowori, and it doesn't need to be a bad word, but you have made it so. For us, the word has come to mean, and in a terrible way, your society has come to represent, the white man that knows too little for the power that he wields and the damage that he causes. You forced your civilization upon us, and now look where we are. Global pandemic, climate crisis, species extinction, and driving it all, widespread spiritual poverty. In all these years of taking from our lands, you have not had the courage or the curiosity or the respect to get to know us, to understand how we see and think and feel, and what we know about life on earth. I won't be able to teach you in this letter either, but what I can say is that it has to do with thousands and thousands of years of love for this forest, for this place. Love in the deepest sense as reverence. This forest has taught us how to walk lightly. And because we have listened, learned, and defended her, she has given us everything: water, clean air, nourishment, shelter, medicines, happiness, meaning. And you are taking all this away, not just from us, but from everyone on the planet and from future generations. It is the early morning in the Amazon, just before first light, a time that is meant for us to share our dreams, our most potent thoughts. And so I say to all of you, the earth does not expect you to save her. She expects you to respect her. And we, as Indigenous peoples, expect the same. The Flourishing Diversity Network has been trying to promote a greater awareness of this extraordinary wisdom that lies with so many Indigenous groups around the world, as a way to remind the weird part of humanity of its responsibilities, so that it can become more careful in the power that it wields, in the ability it has to transform. And in a sense, the tables have been turned. The real savages, the people destroying that which is most valuable, are us. What the Indigenous people remind us of is the sacredness of life. The only true value, the only thing that really matters, that really has value, are the earth, the trees, the land, the birds, the plants, the insects, the animals, that all together, living together, make life possible. Money is worthless in reality. Our planetary health is the only true valuable thing. And when we invited representatives from different Indigenous traditions to come to London last year, almost a year ago today, or 13 months ago, they often began their talks to us not with words, but with song, with ritual. And one of the really important and meaningful rituals that our visitors performed was at the Zero Meridian in Greenwich. And that meridian was created in order to be able to more easily map the world. And so began, from that moment, the great period of colonization, when Europeans went out across the world and stole, took, and invaded whatever they thought was of some value to them. And what the Arhuaco Mamos from Colombia did for us that day was they did a ceremony at the zero meridian where they closed the time of conquest in order to open the time of communication and understanding, to herald in a new era in which all humanity remembers its obligations, not just to itself, but to all the other species on which we depend, so that we can regenerate. And conservation is not enough for what we have to do. We have to start to regenerate as well, to regenerate, to rewild, to regreen those spaces, those areas that we have influence over. And that indeed is the really key point that we try and promote within Flourishing Diversity. But what our visitors did is that they showed us a path to achieving these kinds of radical transformations. And they emphasized the importance of dreaming. Some of our visitors were Guarani people from the Atlantic forest of Brazil. Now, the Atlantic forest is not as well known as the Amazon forest. And that's because 92% of it has been cut down, has been destroyed by the invaders from Europe. And that's, of course, where Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, all the East Coast side of Brazil is based. And the Guarani have a very beautiful philosophy of life. They are nomadic in the forest, or at least they were when there was enough forest to move around in. And their nomadism was guided by the idea that there is somewhere in the forest which is just perfect for you. And when you find that place, if you plant the sacred foods, the sacred seeds of the ancestors, the foods of the gods, and you start to eat them and compose your body of them, of these sacred foods, you will transform yourself from a dwelling on earth to a dwelling in heaven. So in other words, paradise is not somewhere which you await your death to enjoy. It's somewhere which you use your life to find and create and establish through your actions in the world. And this is so much more useful as an orientation for us today, I think, than our traditional religions can offer us. And so our visitors, and this was what was very interesting, is how this same process was recommended by many of the different groups, a process to transformation, 4 steps, in fact, to transformation. And they emphasized that the first step is to know yourself, to truly know yourself, to recognize who you are in the world. And once you do that, then you are able to envision the ideal world, what you that you wish to inhabit. And it's that vision which is the crucial step to transformation. Once you have your vision, once you've cultivated your vision, and dreaming matters, dreaming is important. Once you've developed this vision, then you need to share your vision with others, and you need to dream together with those you love. And once you agree on the vision, once the vision is consolidated and solid between you and those you love, then act on the vision to make it a reality. And we can see these practices emerging in some of our most exploratory and visionary practices in the protests being created by Extinction Rebellion, by those resisting the expansion of HS2 into the last ancient woodlands of this country, where instead of organizing their society along the model that exists in, say, London normally, they organize it based on the ideals that they wish their future to be. Prefiguration. It's a very important thing to do. We all need to start doing this so much more if we're going to find the solutions to ensuring the future of our beautiful planet, our beautiful life on Earth. And the thing about this is that if we want to achieve a space where we are aligned with life, where we are producing diversity, cultivating diversity, it's actually a space of joy. The joy we have in watching our gardens grow, in caring for a pet, in watching our children grow as they flourish into their humanity. These are things which naturally make us happy. We are hardwired to take joy from these activities. And these are the activities that our very survival depends on. So the process of engaging with life is a joyful process. It's not one which is suffering. It's one which will create joy. And as we encourage a diversity of solutions, there is no single right solution. It is for each one of us to imagine the most appropriate way that you, within the constraints of your life and the spaces you have influence over, can encourage and cultivate diversity. If we all do this, then we really can prevent this slide into the sixth great extinction. We really can start to build a paradise on Earth. We can follow the wisdom of the Guarani and others in creating that ideal world that is so close, so within our grasp, if only we reach out and make the steps required to take it. And so in doing that, in starting to step along that joyful journey, we will find the reverence that Nimonte and so many other indigenous people are desperate for us Kawari to remember. And indeed, our very survival probably depends upon it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerome. A wonderful, beautiful presentation, full of love and inspiration. Thank you very much. We can open it now for questions. If anyone, any of you have a question, you're welcome to ask it.
Let me, please, if I may, ask a question.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this presentation.
Yeah. Hussam, can you say briefly who you are and then ask your question?
Sure. My name is Hussam. I'm speaking to you currently from Cairo, where I work here at the German University in Cairo. Well, I'm a bit an outsider to this topic, but it's very interesting indeed. My question would be from the other perspective, because in some perspectives by other, from the other side, some argue that that things don't really have to be ideal in the world in order to exist, and this is why we have different, fields or disciplines or even jobs around the world, from the environmental perspective, from the economic perspective, and so many other. I mean, if we look at the issue from, being on ground. So what do you say to this other perspective? I mean, things really don't have to be ideal in order to survive.
Thank you very much, Hussam. That's an excellent question. Of course, things don't need to be ideal to exist, and my existence is far from ideal, but I persist, thankfully. But at the same time, does suffering, on the extent to which it currently exists, have to persist? And in fact, if we don't manage to transform the way that we inhabit the planet, we are likely to set off a series of cascading consequences on ecology, on the systems that sustain us, our food supply, and many other elements. And that cascade is what scientists are identifying as the sixth great extinction event. There's a certain tipping point in many of these losses. So for instance, if CO2 rises above 2 causes a greater than 2 degrees warming in the atmosphere, the cascade of consequences will be so great that it will take thousands of years for us to return to something like the stability we are familiar with in this in our earlier decades of this recent times. So although things don't need to be ideal to exist, we do need to be very conscious that if we continue putting up with things which are not just far from ideal, but damaging to life in principle, then we do threaten our very existence. And it's that threat, that existential threat that's posed by our current ways of organizing ourselves that is of great concern. And of course, you know, whatever solutions we try, there will still be suffering, there still will be difficulty. Death is inevitable, all things come to an end. Everyone is here for a limited period only. The overall continuation of the opportunity for those moments of joy, of happiness, of rejoicing, of reverence to occur will be greater. And after all, you know, do we wish our children to live in deserted landscapes, struggling for water to find the basics for their lives? Or do we wish them to enjoy an indulgent and abundant space where they can thrive and flourish? These are the questions I think that our lifestyle really requires us to think about. And flourishing diversity as a concept seeks to just make it very simple. You know, if we each act to produce diversity, whether it's in the balcony of your apartment in Cairo or the back garden of your house in Paris, it is equally valid, it is equally significant, equally important. There's some major initiatives to re-green and re-wild cities. In London, we have the London National Park City. These things need to go on in every single space, and every human being has to take responsibility for producing diversity. And in that way, we align with life and we will resolve these issues. And that really is the key purpose that we're trying to put into a better understanding of the significance of flourishing diversity, of a space where we really can begin to produce the solutions that will ensure a habitable earth for future generations.